we share the goal of reducing volatility and creating a system that produces guidelines for schools to reliably plan more than 1 year ahead. Those are all great things that a budget model can do. But how we get there is important, and especially important for the workers who bear the cost of the decisions being made. Though the financial situation of the university has improved some since its most dire projections in winter and spring of 2025, we believe that the process by which this model was adopted to distribute funds to schools, and especially the negative impact it's having on some schools, needs wider discussion. And so it's in that spirit that we're here today. So, to help us understand the budget model and how it was adopted, we've invited two distinguished guests to help us make sense of how we got here. Budgets are opaque, perhaps by design in some cases, and we are going to gain critical budget literacy here thanks to Christopher Newfield, Director of Research for the Independent Social Research Foundation in the United Kingdom, and George van den Abbeele, UCI professor and former dean of the School of Humanities at UCI. So just a note that we're going to record the public presentations of the next few speakers. We will save the final 15 minutes of the hour for question and answer. And after that, those who want to continue the conversation may stay on this Zoom to discuss the ways that Senate faculty can address the topics we've discussed. And lecturers and librarians represented by UC-AFT will be encouraged to join a separate breakout session.
And so many of us may know or be familiar with Chris Newfield and his either scholarship, his blog, advocacy, but it's my distinct honor to introduce him nonetheless. He is the Director of Research for the Independent Social Research Foundation in the UK. Prior to his recently moving to London, he served as a professor of English at UC Santa Barbara for over 30 years, 10 of which included chairing and serving on that campus's Planning and Budget Council. He has published 3 books on higher ed finance, politics, and culture: Ivy and Industry, Business and the Making of the American University, Unmaking the Public University, The 40-Year Assault on the Middle Class, and The Great Mistake: How We Wrecked Public Universities and How We Can Fix Them. He also serves as the co-editor of the Critical University Studies series for Johns Hopkins Press, and his blog, Remaking the University, has served as an important site of faculty knowledge and advocacy against austerity politics since the beginning of the Great Recession. Finally, last summer, Chris published 3 articles on UC Irvine's budget model for his blog, including a piece which we can link to in the chat called The Trouble at the UC Irvine Core. Please welcome Chris Newfield, generously zooming in from London.
Hi, hi all. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here, and I will now try to share my screen, which, wait, okay, desktop 2. All right, you can see Trevor, and let me try this. How's that? Do you see the main screen?
Yep, we can see you now.
That's great. Okay, because you all totally disappeared. Okay, I actually really mean this title, which sounds quite bizarre. I mean, I get a lot of pleasure out of budget studies, and the reason is not just because of just the I don't know, the clarity of some of the documentation. It has to do with the development of understanding of the institutional conditions for what it is that all of us do, and also the sense that it leads to having influence over those activities, the possibility of wider collaboration among faculty, staff, students, administrators, discussions with other disciplines. In other words, the creation of a kind of a polity of self-understanding around the production of knowledge in a campus community that is basically fractured into our daily activities and also divided by disciplines and offices, etc. This is not the normal definition, however, of budgets or the normal affect associated with it, which really for the last 25 years at UC in particular has consisted of, constraints, cuts, efficiency-based impairments of academic activity, and then the attempt to get some kind of a grip on it through models that generally come from one part of the campus and have not evolved out of wider discussions about academic needs. So Irvine has produced a new budget model which has some strengths and some positive aspects, but I don't think that it succeeds in rising above what the basic imperative is, which is to take the budget situation in the state and extend efficiency practices that are basically, now very well embedded into the institution. So it's cuts on previous cuts, and it's austerity on a structure of austerity that's been under development for the last 25 years. So I'm going to offer a few elements of what I think is an alternative framework for getting out of the austerity vision in relation to budget models. And it would lead to something like this, some kind of understanding the political economy of knowledge, knowledge creation, teaching, research, and all the support activities that go along with that. Okay, the first element, there are 5 of them, is having proper context, which is almost always missing from these discussions, and particularly an understanding of historical trends. The second one is completeness, and that includes not just top-level stuff, but the relevant unit levels where people actually experience their educations and or lack thereof, given current restraints. It also involves understanding the funding of research costs, which is the topic that I'm going to end with. And then there are 3 others that I'm not going to talk about much, but I'm going to just list them. The third is the sort of the establishing the conceptual, really the philosophical priority of substantive educational goals over budgeting, so that educational quality and experience should lead to an understanding of budget requirements and not the other way around. It sounds utopian, but I think that's just because of the sort of degraded experience that we've had over the last several decades, in which all of our academic desires and ambitions are sort of pre-formatted by the always restrained resources that are being offered to support them. And part of this project is creating transparency not only around the numbers themselves, and the resources, but around the educational effects of those resources or lack thereof. And this is completely missing from this model, and it's almost entirely missing from all sort of higher level, decision level discussions of budgeting at UC and more or less at every university that I'm familiar with. So this would be a major change. Fourth is the goal of distributional fairness, or what's sometimes called distributive justice. And this doesn't mean that everything's the same for everybody, but it would mean that there'd be an apportioning of resources in relation to the diverse educational goals of diverse units. So some disciplines need more equipment than others, and some need larger or smaller class sizes than others. But these differences would be hammered out within a framework of equity, fairness, justice. And then the last is the informed consent of the governed, which is a guiding principle in United States political theory, mostly honored in the breach. It would be really great to have something like that at universities that fashion themselves as kind of the leading edge of thinking and also organizational propriety in the United States. And another way of putting this point is to say that it would overcome the really odd and, in my view, very dysfunctional dualism, epistemically, socially, discursively, between the academic operation on the one side and administration on the other. And it's not just senior managers, it's also the staff that's distributed throughout the academic operation, but then gets siloed into operational tasks that are not actually part on a daily basis of the educational mission. So I think we need all 5 of these. This is a long-term project. I'm just going to talk about the first 2. So back to the top, context, historical trends. You can do a little belt tightening if you haven't been tightening your belt for 25 years already. And the absence of understanding of that trend, I think, makes the budget model that you have seem more plausible and more, I don't know, viable educationally than it actually is. If you've looked at the Remaking blog, you may have seen a version of this chart, which I've been updating for a long time now. The blue line is the benchmark. It goes up in relation to state per capita income. So it's meant to be a measure of the resources that California residents actually have in their pockets to spend on education or health or cars or cell phones or whatever they spend it on. The yellow line is inflated for UC enrollment growth. So it's basically the blue line just accounting for the increasing number of students that UC always has. And that's, you can see the growth over the 21st century. The purple line is the actual state budget, which is pretty close to $250 billion in the coming year. And then the red line is what the state sees fit to actually give the University of California in terms of the general fund. And the point of this slide is just the disassociation between state resources and UC resources that come from the state. So we don't track the state budget. We don't go up with the state budget and down when the state budget goes down. It just goes off on its own. And the same is true for enrollment growth. We haven't kept up with that in terms of state investment. So we are, put it another way, uniquely persecuted by the state, along with Cal State. The two higher education systems do the worst over time in terms of state allocations. Here's a modification of that same slide, because of course people always say, well, what about tuition? That's gone up a lot. And so I took the state out, I put other resources in addition to the general fund in, so that creates the green line. And it accounts for the fact that there were a couple of huge expenses pushed onto UC books by state inaction or lack thereof in the 2010s. And the two biggest are state didn't backfill the restart of pension contributions. So the employer contribution now at UC, I think, is 14.5% this year. And that's a huge operational burden. And the same is true of capital projects, which used to be floated through state bonds, and that is no longer the case. So UC has to borrows and then takes interest payments and also some other sort of direct capital outlays out of its operating budget in a way that it didn't have to do before. So what you see is even when you throw in kind of unaffordable tuition for most UC students, in spite of the genuine efforts that UC has made to manage affordability, it still doesn't get up to either the benchmark or enrollment needs in the yellow line. Okay, so that kind of context suggests that cuts now at UC Irvine and other UC campuses are highly undesirable and in fact, threaten the sustainability certainly of the quality of the mission. And this gets us to the second one, which is just the completeness. Like, how do you really understand how the money's flowing, how resources are allocated? And it requires as much sort of bigger budget information than you get on the public site. So just a couple of examples of that. This is sort of the public top level budget from last year, from fiscal year 25. And I use this one because they actually lined up three general classifications next to each other. There's the schools, there's the support units, and there's the central administrative organizations. And the thing that jumps out at me, especially the first time I looked at this, is that there's 689 million in the schools, sort of the academic core of the core. And there's almost 500 million putting the next two columns together for administration broadly construed. And that seems like quite a high ratio of administration to academics. The same is true for the deficit, which is more administrative than academic. So again, this, let's make one wonder whether the cuts really need to come from the academic core and come from somewhere else. But we don't actually know because this doesn't really tell us what the money's being used for or how it's flowing. It's just not complete enough. And just one more example of this. This is from this year's, and it's total UCI. That's the label. This is not total UCI. This is just what's being called the core. And what jumped out at me in that circle is that the deficit has gone down from the projections last year. I think earlier in 2025. So it's down to 31.4 million. And juxtapose that to carry forward of 800 million, which is just enormous. I mean, another way of putting this is that you could avoid all cuts, maintain a deficit of 31 million, and cover it with this carry forward, paying it down to the year 2050. So put it another way, there's nothing in this top level information that suggests that cuts must come to the academic side. It just opens the door to discussion and negotiation rather than actually suggesting that the current plan is necessary. Okay, so this is incomplete. When you get more complete information, when you get down to unit level information, and you look at what the new budget model was projected to create, you get really sort of horrifying images like this one, which was a representation of the change in base budgets with subventions, right? So the guardrails are in this one to try to soften the blow to some units. And this is the change in base budgets from 23, 24 to the current year, fiscal year 26. And you see a very, unpleasant pattern of STEM getting richer and non-STEM getting poorer on the left-hand side. So the loss is going to humanities, arts, business, which is kind of is a social science. Social science is education, social ecology, and then net positives on the other side. So you don't really want to see that if you're looking for not only equity around instructional quality, because students who decide to major in the arts shouldn't be disproportionately punished compared to their counterparts who are in public health or engineering. They're paying the same tuition. But also in terms of knowledge creation and knowledge distribution, right? Research and teaching, you need all the disciplines, you need all the knowledges, and the knowledges have to be able to work together. And in order to do that, they have to be kind of on the same scale and have analogous resource bases to be developed and pushed out and interconnected in order to deal with, the social problems that we're facing in abundance. And you can't have that if half of the campus is essentially being starved. And the other half, our STEM comrades are also being starved, but just slightly less. Okay, I mean, this is not great news for them, and this is not at all to set these two sides of the campus together. We have to work together, quite to the contrary. But you don't want this pattern in any case, and you also want to know why the budget model generated this. And I tried to figure this out, and it has something to do with the cost of instruction benchmarks that were taken from the National Study on the Cost of Instructional Productivity that was run by the University of Delaware until they discontinued it last year. But it's undesirable, and it's not explained by the model itself. A whole other set of discourse needs to happen. Okay, so this question, how do you connect these things? There's a bunch of discourse that I'm not going to go through this. This is just to flash a slide of the personnel factor definition and the funding per student definition. And I will certainly come back to this if you don't agree, that these don't explain it. The 70-30, it doesn't explain the pattern that may now be somewhat mitigated because the cuts are smaller, but which was generated by the model in its initial run. And then there's also this. So the thing we've been talking about is just a fraction of the overall budget, and the claim that all the losses or all the deficits are accruing in core funds is not true. And there's documentation of central funding going, for example, the School of Medicine, the schedules for the UC health system in general, which is broken down by campus, show deficits being run off and on by the UCI health system, like most of the other health systems. So they require subvention also. Subsidies are flowing in every direction. And so there isn't a prima facie justification for the deficits being attributed to the core and nowhere else, and then the cuts coming disproportionately to the core and nowhere else. It's just not the existing information doesn't justify that. Okay, now I'm just going to wrap up by talking about this the research issue.
So 1 to 2 minutes left.
Okay, yeah, I can do it. Research loses money for every university that conducts it. And that's a good thing because it's expensive, there's no way around the losses, and it's a plus to society. It's a benefit to humanity. The question is who is going to pay for the losses? And what has been happening disproportionately over the last decades, and this is from the AAU, is that at the same time that states have been cutting their contribution to public research universities, the federal government has been more than doubling the share of research expenditures that have to come from the campuses. So it went from 10% in 1970, and it was about 8% in 65, to 25% today. And so what that means at Irvine, this is the 4 smallest UC campuses where Irvine is the big of the smalls, is it spends $125 million in fiscal year 24 to subsidize research. That is not accounted in the budget model. And there's an additional issue that comes up with this, which is when you take that band and you turn it into this bar, and then you distinguish between STEM and non-STEM, or S&E in the NSF parlance. What you see is almost all of it goes to STEM and very little of it goes to non-STEM. And of 125,791,000 in total are spent institutionally on the humanities at UC Irvine, even though the School of Humanities is, a storied and prominent place for humanities research, both in the UC system and in the nation as a whole. So again, the new budget model isn't fixing the research funding calamity for STEM and also for non-STEM. And it's likely to make it worse, given the fact that it doesn't deal at all with this particular issue. Okay, so what we have actually is this, rather than what we need. Weak contest incompleteness, research losses not correctly booked, budgeting driving education, distributional opacity, likely injustice, but it's covered up, so we can't have a proper conversation about it, and then uninformed non-consent of the governed as the default situation, in spite of the efforts of events like this and the people that are participating in it. We need to get this, and I'm just going to say one last thing about the national and sort of international social stakes for this. I mean, we're in the middle of a knowledge disaster in the United States where society is decreasingly able to even define, much less actually address its core problems as a result of sort of knowledge disorder that's being actively cultivated by a lot of political forces. And in the midst of all this, universities are more needed than ever to provide some kind of advanced knowledge on topics like, for example, critical race theory, when racism and anti-immigration sentiment have become a national crisis. And yet, at this moment of greatest need for the university presence and university output, universities have been discredited politically, are being cut by political entities with the consent of the business community, and are also shooting themselves in the foot with disproportionate forms of austerity that are also misallocated across different domains. So the reason to engage in the joy of budget studies is to create new knowledge on the scale and intensity that humanity actually needs, and doing it by repairing the institutions that we are operating in now that could be doing a better job than they are. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Chris. That was incredibly illuminating. We have a lot to learn from you, and indeed, you've convinced us of the joy of budget studies. So
I
it's
really doubt. You're now really gaslighting me.
no way. So it is now my pleasure to introduce George van den Abbeele, who is a professor with appointments in three humanities departments at UCI: English, Comparative Literature, and European Languages and Studies. And in addition to being co-author of 10 books, he's served an administrative position at three different UC campuses. He's directed three different programs in an institute during his almost 15 years at UC Davis. He served as Dean of Humanities at UC Santa Cruz, founding Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities at Northeastern University, and Dean of UCI's School of Humanities from 2013 to 2018. And also importantly for our purposes, he served as chair of the UC Irvine Academic Senate's Council on Planning and Budget during part of the time that the UC Irvine was developing its new budget model. Please join me in welcoming George.
Thank you, everybody. It's good to be here, and a lot of old friends and the rest. And I think the main reason I'm here is because I was chairing CPB at the time the budget model was being proposed, and I'm trying to avoid repeating what Chris so eloquently and precisely explained to us with the very helpful charts and the rest, and explain a little bit of where we were with this and some of the challenges that are going on with this. Um, and actually, I see that Maria Pantelia is here, and she's currently chairing CPB. So, Maria, if I make mistakes or if things have changed, please correct me because I was on leave last year, so I'm not completely on top of what's going on with CPB right now. I know one of the things that I did do, and it goes to the shared governance issue, is try to align what CPB at Irvine does with what CPB does at other campuses. And we were nowhere near getting the amount of information or having the amount of um, ability to consult that were true of the other campuses, Davis, Santa Cruz, and Berkeley, all three of which I've taught at. And those campuses, CPB will weigh in on, faculty hires. They have access to and discuss the specific budgets of local deans and the rest. And we got that approved both in terms of the Senate and in agreement with the Provost office, and we're trying to keep that going. Um, in terms of budget models, um, I don't know how familiar people are with these. I mean, there are many different versions. There's the cross-subsidy model, which I learned at Davis, where basically tuition dollars generated in humanities and social sciences help subsidize the sciences, which in turn, through their ICR and research dollars, cross-subsidize humanities research. And that has very beneficial elements on general campus culture, where it doesn't feel so competitive between units. Although it's been 20 years since I taught it there, so again, I can't speak to what they have done now, which I suspect is something similar to what we see here. The model that's developed here is supposed to replace incremental funding, which is basically everyone gets the same amount, but a little bit more each year, which is not really true because it can also be decremental funding where everyone gets a little less than in previous years and versions of the like. There are also formulaic funding models of various kinds where, various formula are used to distribute resources. And there's RCM models where everything is derived from the units and they pay a tax centrally. All of these are good and bad features, as I think Chris was also just said in his presentation. They there's good ways to do it and there's bad ways to do it. We have a kind of a hybrid model here. It has been proposed. The terms have been used as mission-based, which suggests that the things that are most important are what we do and value, which is education and research, and that it would be a predictable model so that units could plan ahead and not feel that they are in a year-by-year lurch in terms of what resources are available. I would say 2 years down the line, it's neither one. From what I hear from dean's offices is that it's not at all predictable. Things are changing, and one cannot adapt to these changes. And the mission-based thing, I have a little bit of skepticism. I mean, all of this budget modeling, on one hand, was presented as we do need a model because we don't have one, but also into this kind of looming fiscal cliff that is always presented as happening next year. And it's been happening next year for several years now, where suddenly we're going to go into a massive structural deficit, which will be almost impossible to come out of. But again, that depends on how one looks at the finances between, and one of the things we did focus on in our CPB discussions was the rather obscure relationship between the core and the non-core parts of the campus funding. And just to give one example, I mean, it's not just you know the health side of the campus, the hospital, and the rest. It's not just the research park. It's not just that, but there are places where it's almost impossible to determine which is which. And specifically, if you look at the health science colleges, and this is, by the way, not just a UCI issue. This has been discussed at the system-wide level at the UC-PB, where the entire relationship between the health services side of UC and the academic side of UC is almost impossible to figure out because there are clinical professors and how they're funded and what is going one way or the other in ways that make it very unclear which one we should be looking at. I just want to say a couple of words. I'm not going to rehash our entire letter, which should be made available. Actually, I was asked. Okay, here. Okay, we're good. A copy. Thank you, Aaron. I appreciate that. Yeah, I've been trying to talk to Jane Stuver to make sure that it's supposed to be in the archives of the Senate, and for some reason, that and the response are hard to get. So I've been sending out my own versions to people. But the three elements, the student credit hours, that actually seems pretty good. It's improved from not counting upper division courses to counting them. That was one of our critiques, that those were not included in the original budget calculations, which is kind of crazy because those are all your majors. And even so, the argument was that some would not be your majors, but it should count. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to leave that, but apparently that has been changed. And then, of course, the state allocations, which is used to fund up to 70% of the faculty's salaries. And we've discussed that. Well, how does the other 30% come in and the like? But I do want to focus on two things while I have a few minutes of your time. One is reserves. I mean, and as Chris just showed in the cycle, we have a reserve at UCI of something like 60% of budget, which is astronomical. But if you go through the schools, you're going to find, many of them have, 25, 30, 40% of budget tied up in reserves. This is also part of the budget model recommendation is should be 15 to 20%, which is actually less than most of the schools already have. Now, why do I focus on that? Well, this is a potential political liability. About 12, 13 years ago, when I first came here, the state legislature was really very adamantly tracking the fact of reserve funding in UC. And we're very upset because this was legislature allocated funds that were supposed to go to funding the university. And why were we putting it away in, really significant reserve funds for waiting for a rainy day when this legislature was saying, well, when that comes, we'll work it out. I mean, and that's not to say that the legislature is supporting us as much as they should, but they were feeling like we're giving you money and you're not even spending it. There's been an incredible political liability. And to see this amount of money there. Secondly, that's money that is being turned away. So why are we then, on the one hand, cutting things when the money is there to support it? And that there's can't get an answer on that. That's really a provost office question, if we could get an answer from them. And the second element that was the cost of instruction, which we talked about a lot in our CPB deliberations. I mean, actually, one of the top items we had, this was in the spring of 24, was the model that was proposed to begin in summer of 24. And we said, hold on, you can't invent something like this as radical within 2 months and expect it to work. Can you please put it back 6 months or a fiscal year so that we could figure out how it should work? That was, rebutted by the provost. They said, no, we're going ahead. We'll just tweak it as we go along, which sounds a little bit like learning to fly while you're in the plane. I mean, very, not a very comforting idea. But that was a sort of model. There was a promise that there would be ongoing Senate faculty input as we moved along, but I can't really track how much of that has happened, if any. Um, but the cost of instruction issue in particular was one of the items we flagged. I mean, what does that mean? And it could mean a lot of things, and usually small class sizes. Some instruction must be done in small classes. I mean, writing, language and labs, things need to be done at a scale which is going to be more costly because you can't do it in a giant lecture format. You can't do it online. It has to be done that way. There is also a question of some facilities, especially in the arts. I think I mean, on that chart that Chris showed us, the humanities looks like it's taking the giant cut, but the arts are in bad shape too. And if you affect that the arts actually have a much smaller budget, it may be it's much more significant than it shows on that chart. And because they have to have studios, you can't teach sculpting or painting or dramaturgy in a lecture offline mode. It's got to be done with real stuff in real time. Um, and cost of instructors varies a great deal. In fact, I was curious to see why business is one of the schools that is in trouble, and I think it's because business faculty are on a separate salary scale, so they have much higher salaries than other academics in UC, and therefore that's a cost of instruction. So you have three things. Now, our thinking at the time was high cost of instruction. We get it. That is going to be linked to subsidies because if you have a high cost of instruction, that is material that you cannot just simply wish away by teaching it differently, then that needs to be supported. But instead, what we seem to be observing, and certainly in the last two cycles, is that cost of instruction, based upon that rather dubious Delaware accounting system, seems to be used as a liability. So somehow high cost instruction is a source of excuse to cut rather than a necessary subsidy to be added in. So I'll just end on that because I think that's it. I could go on about ICRs but Chris has already said that better than I can. But I think that those are two things that are slightly different from our report. One is the question of reserves and what does that mean? And is that the good thing that it's presented to be when in fact it may be a liability both in terms of current instruction and in terms of eventual state legislature support, and two, the rather questionable use of cost of instruction as a kind of necessary subsidy that's instead been turned into a place for cuts to be made. So I'll stop there, and I guess I hope we have time for questions later. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you, George. In fact, I want to use the privilege of just transitioning us to the next thing, just to clarify one thing. So you've highlighted that some of the discussions in CPB about the budget model as it was being developed was really about, at least in part, how to deal with the high cost of instruction. I imagine there might have also been stuff related to research and what you're talking about at ICR and Chris's talk.
Yeah.
Can you just tell us, because most of us don't sit in on academic Senate meetings and many of the discussions of CPB are not necessarily even made public to all the academic Senate members, can you just describe the response you got from the letter we've shared in the chat? And yeah.
Yeah, so actually, we have minutes taken in those meetings. I think those are in principle available. Oh, no, they're not. Okay. So that's sometimes they have been, sometimes they haven't. I mean, that's an issue. But um, generally, I think it was a very unanimous CPB. A lot of us were, supported. And I think, in fact, I would probably say the letter is more toned down than some of us wanted it to be. Secondly, the response from the Provost's office, was primarily more of a rebuttal than a response. They were okay. We make points, but this is what we're going to do, which always makes the question of consultation seem very dubious. I mean, we're being asked, but the response taken. The one thing that was taken seriously was the fact that in the original calculation they had completely forgotten to include benefits, and benefits on personnel is like 30% of the cost. I mean, it's a massive mistake. And they did agree that we have made an excellent point on that, so they put that back in. But of course, that merely makes it um, more of a problematic budget than it was before, because it meant that there was even less that they were dealing with. So, so I think that letter should be available too, the provost response. I mean, one can read it, and you can decide for yourselves.
Right. All right, so we are in the fortunate and unfortunate situation of having had an excellent panel. And George, it's my understanding you have to teach at 1 o'clock. Is that right? Oh, you're muted. Just a sec.
Funny things with the mute and unmute here.
Oh, yeah.
No, I teach it too, so I'm okay.
Oh, good. Oh,
Yeah,
good.
yeah,
So
yeah.
we have
No, no,
extra
I'll be
time.
fine. No, 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 no.
So,
I probably have
so
to leave
there,
about quarter to two, but that's okay.
oh, I
Yeah.
totally misunderstood. That's
No, no.
excellent. So there are two things I'd like to suggest. I'm going to compress my presentation down to about 2 or 3 minutes. And then if we're open to it, maybe we can stay till about 1:15 in a Q&A. We understand many people will need to leave before 1 o'clock because of how our schedules are. And
Hmm.
then we can sort of break into the discussions of what next after that. But I'd hate to compress the Q&A time too much. The one thing I just wanted to flag at others' suggestion is that we do have access to how deans responded to the budget model projections given to them in May. And I wanted to flag just some data from that, not go into details or look at specific documents. Give me just a second to pull that one sort of slide up that I have so that I can just give a sense of the impact, but also the conversation that we have not been having. Um, where when you see, okay, this level of dissent was raised, but we haven't been talking about it for the past year. So let's see if I can do that. Great. And then I will go to slideshow and play from start. So hopefully can you all see that? I can't see you. I didn't.
No, we see your presenter view. So if you just
Uh,
swap displays,
Okay, I'm not sure how to do that.
button in the top left.
So uh, this one here, that
Maybe
there.
try that. Yeah.
Well, maybe you can see this pretty well, right?
Yes. Yeah.
All right, why don't I just zoom in on this and expand it a little bit so that that is what we do, and I don't have to walk you through any tech issues. So 6 schools out of about 16, no, I think maybe 15. So roughly 40% of all schools' deans indicated in their letters to central administration that they sent in May of 2025 that given the budget projections and in terms of revenue that they were going to be given, um, that they would not be able to balance their budgets by 2028. And so I put together those 6 schools. Those were arts, humanities, nursing, pharmacy, social ecology, and social sciences. And I pulled together some basic data on them. This is the undergraduate credit hours. This is undergraduate degrees. This is graduate credit hours. This is the percent state tuition and other that they receive as a percent going to all schools. So not all state tuition and the other category go to schools, but of the percentage that do, this is what it looks like. And then this is the percentage of core sources. So core supposedly being what pays for the majority of teaching, though as both George and Chris have indicated, sometimes the core, non-core definitions bleed together. And what you see is if we add these together, the departments that or the schools that provide 45% of the undergraduate credit hours and 49% of the undergraduate majors, those deans have said this budget model as given to us in May does not work long term. And this is some of the urgency that we feel in bringing this discussion to you now and stepping outside the normal channels of communication. Uh, Often people have to talk about these things privately. There's a lot of intrigue. There's a lot of politics of civility and secrecy. But part of what I hope that this event can do is say, shared governance means taking on these issues and thinking about these issues critically, and especially if we talk about the cost of instruction. So clearly, this isn't taking into account costs of research, other things. I'm not saying just because you teach 45% of the undergraduate credit hours that you should get 45% of the tuition that's going to schools. But you can see 20% of all the core sources, the majority of which is made up of student tuition and state allocation, is going to the schools that provide about 50% of the undergraduate education. And so I just wanted to flag that one statistic. I have other slides that talk about quotes where people explain, okay, we're not sure about accreditation or other things. But rather than go into that, I just wanted that to be a framing point so we weren't just talking rhetorically or hyperbolically, but saying we have some information that is unusual for us to have, but that gives us a sense of urgency today. And with that, I'm happy to open up a discussion and take questions from the audience.